And now we are very happy to welcome Felipe Monteiro, whom you have already seen talking with Jean-Claude Beaver this morning. And now Felipe will be talking about corporate innovation and how startups can actually enhance the creativity of multinational corporations. So please, Felipe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katja. Good evening, everyone. I'll be brief and try to offer you some ideas. I should also say that you have my contact details here. I'm happy to send all the slides I'm showing. So you heard a concrete example of a large corporate working with startups. Let me offer you something that might be very intuitive to many of you, why they would do this. Many times because the startups would have the novel solutions that they don't have. But I think it's also interesting to think about the next two, which is many times that it's not that the startups don't have the whole novel solution, but many times they would have pieces of the solution that combined with what you have. Then it is something really novel. And I even say that one of the main reasons for corporates to work with startups is this idea that they can challenge the dominant logic of the corporation. It's challenge the way, the mindset that they have. And I think we should not underestimate, up and above any benefit of any specific product that they can get from startups, is this change in mindset. I'm saying this in 1 minute. I probably spent the last 15 years of my life trying to kind of understand this. So just take this statement of saying there's a lot of research backing this up. You have heard a lot about this idea of open innovation, right? How corporates get ideas from outside into their innovation pipeline. Let me give you some concrete examples. I think for those of you who are familiar with the pharmaceutical sector, part of the reason the corporates are so pressured to do this is something called patent cliffs. And patent cliffs is what happens when the pharma companies lose the patents, right? When the patents expire, and they're losing billions and billions of dollars. So the same way that you see BMW being pressured to connect, or any automaker to connect with startups because of the electric car and other things coming in mobility, you have seen sectors like pharma, they've been so pressured to work with startups because they've seen billions of the revenues disappearing, and this is what happened. Just to give you one figure, 2/3 of the drugs that we see here in terms of blockbusters, the origin of the drug was not in the pharma company who is selling the drug to you. So 2/3 of what you see in terms of big innovation in pharma is not coming from the pharma which is selling it to you, but from another company that we didn't see. You may have seen this example before. This is, right, a classic story of a crazy scientist from a startup that knocks on the door of Procter & Gamble. How many of you have heard about this story before? Any of you? No? So Ian, so you may think this is a mistake slide. It was my daughter who put it there. So the story is a crazy scientist knocks on the door of Procter & Gamble and say, you know, I have a small engine that can turn kind of lollipops around. And if you're Procter & Gamble, what do you say? Say, I mean, go away, you're crazy, we don't do lollipops. But basically, what they did with that was the toothbrush, okay? And I think the insight here is many times the connection with startups will not come from your sector, and not even come, or not even be used where the startups were thinking you could use it. And I think this is one of those classic examples. If you're curious, just go and Google and look at kind of what Procter & Gamble is doing in this area. They even change the idea of research and development. We heard that BMW spends $7 billion in R&D. P&G is saying, no, we're not even call it R&D anymore. We call it connect and develop, because a lot of what we want to do is not research ourselves, but connecting with other firms. So maybe you're already convinced of that. What I'd like to spend maybe the next 10 minutes is just telling you why I believe it's so difficult to do so. And I'd like to leave you with a couple of ideas on this. I think what a lot of the big corporates are doing, and they should be doing this, but it's not enough, is how do I place the radars in different parts of the world with different mechanisms? Is it CVCs, the venture client? It is just external innovation, it's licensing. There's so many ways of accessing some ideas. It's the lab. And the question here is access. I'm convinced, and I think one of the privileges of being a professor in a place like Insead is that you see the world through the cases of the companies you work with, right? And so I have been lucky enough to be working with so many different companies from many different parts of the world. And I'm convinced that that part of the story, access, it is difficult, but it's not the main problem. The main problem is not how do you access those startups, how do you connect with them. I think the main problem is how do you take action? How do you, after you have been exposed to all those ideas, have contacted the startups, right? We saw two great ideas, two great startups just showing what they're doing, is if you are a big organization, what do you do with that? Maybe one image, right, that you can have in your mind is this idea of how do you have a landing pad, right? How do you have some place where those external ideas will land? And maybe even more important is, can you understand why many times those things don't land? And I'd like to offer you two possible reasons and also leave you with one alternative of how to deal with that. I think Katya told me that the drinks outside will be, in addition to the champagne we had, we're going to have some nice bottles of Romane Conti. And for those of you who like wine, this is a very good wine, very expensive, very difficult to get. But would you open a bottle of Romane Conti with someone who never had wine before? Probably not. And even with someone who had tried wine but never really tried many different things, you would not open, you could, but probably would be a waste of money and good wine. Because for you to really understand, right, the nuances, the subtleties, or the dentelle, like right, people say here, of a wine like this one, you need to have a lot of what we call absorbed capacity. Capacity to absorb what you're getting. So I believe sometimes the problem with big corporations in their collaboration with startups is many times inside the organization people cannot understand it. And it's a cognitive problem. They don't, right? They may not understand those new technologies. They may not understand what is coming from. This can be coming from very unrelated industries. And I think the problem here, if the problem is not understanding, okay, and the problem is really cognitive, is this idea of you don't have capacity to understand. The solution should be, right, how do you train people? How do you expose, right, the management to those new technologies? How do you send them in expeditions to Silicon Valley, to Station F, you name it. But it's really an issue of cognition. It's really an issue of training people on this. I believe this is a problem, but I believe an even bigger problem is not related to cognition. Is related to motivation and is related to the preparation, the mindset that people have to accept ideas from outside that many times will challenge, right? We heard this lunch, right? Jean-Claude talk about those convictions, right? The sacred cows of the organization. And a lot of the times, what startups will tell you is they will come with things saying, no, these are not very good truths for you. You've been doing this forever. It doesn't look like that the future will be what you've been doing forever. And if this is a problem, right, if the problem is not an issue of I don't understand what those startups are telling me, but what they are telling me, it is really challenging in the sense of which direction we should take, how much this is really challenging what we believe in and what we have done. This solution has nothing to do with cognition. You can train people, you can show them all the new technologies, you can send them to the best expeditions and, right, and they go and they visit and they talk. They will never get it because it's not an issue of understanding. It's an issue of really agreeing. is an issue of how do you change your mindset, how you understand that you need to change. And my suggestion to you, and I think, is at the very minimum, I think, first of all, you have to step back and say, do we have an issue of, do we have access to those startups? Is an issue of access or an issue of action? And if it's an issue of action, the problem of the lack of action is a cognitive problem or is really a motivation problem. And what I would like to end, and just to have a final slide there, is and I've worked with a lot of companies that went to Silicon Valley to do this, and there is one silver lining there, and which should be reassuring to a number of you, is there are some people in the organization that can really play a very important role in that connection between startups and corporates. I think the technical term that I use, and a number of my colleagues use, is called boundary spanners, kind of people who span boundaries. And what are boundary spanners? Are people who live in different worlds, who live in different, right? They have the connections both in the corporate and in startup world, who can speak both the language of marketing and technology, who can see about the new and the old. And you see, right, as Jean-Claude Bivet was talking about this earlier today, this idea of this fusion, I'm convinced, okay, that to overcome those barriers, we need people who have the cognition, meaning I can talk to both worlds, I have the language, I can translate, I can say this is what's happening in the startup world, I can translate to the corporate. But it's not an issue only of cognition, it's also people who have the credibility inside the organization to say, you know, this is what the startup is doing, it's challenging what we believe or what we have done in the past. But I have, right, and those people have enough leadership and enough credibility within the organization to make it work. So my sense, I'm convinced corporates and startups have a lot to learn from each other, and I think you heard one example before with the BMW. I think access is an issue, but not the main one. I think the main issue is about how do you really act on what you see, and when you think about how do you overcome the challenges of inaction, you have to separate between what it is cognition versus what it is motivation, and you have to think about having people who can do both. My last slide is exactly what I just said. If you are interested, there are a number of, I have been writing about this, there are a number of articles from the Insead managerial version to the very kind of academic paper explaining that. So why don't I stop here? Maybe we have time for a couple of questions, and then we have the next speaker waiting.
Felipe, only for you, because you're our VIP. And any questions?
If you want to skip questions, I mean, I'm happy to take questions offline as well.
If there is some passionate person who would like to ask the question that would just be very relevant, no questions?
So Katja, why don't I do the following?
Yes.
This is the beautiful campus.
Yes,
not
Fontainebleau, you're welcome to.
I think here you have my contact details. I'm happy to be connected with you and take questions afterwards. And then we have someone else waiting. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you for all your support for the Insead Global Luxury Forum. And from the professor, we are going to another speaker.